1% male, that 1 in 2 males. Trauma basically keeps you away from the center like a pendulum. Though we think that men are more empowered, but when it comes to male abuse, being sexually abused by a male relative,
welcome to another episode of Healing Minds, where we explore important mental health topics. Today, we are diving into a subject that often flies under the radar: male abuse. Men can be victims too, but the conversation around male abuse tends to be silenced and overlooked. To unpack this very complex issue, we have Dr. Meghna, a holistic psychiatrist and therapist, joining us. Welcome, Dr. Meghna.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for having me again with you. And it is a very important topic, and that set me thinking into that there is so less awareness, and lesser than the awareness, there is so much lesser motivation for men to come out in the open and talk about it. So it's a great initiative, great topic that you have taken up. And it's interesting that 2 women are talking about male abuse. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting conversation.
But then when we look around, where are the male advocates for male rape and abuse? I don't find...
Absolutely. And the few that I have heard have been all women.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting maybe because women probably are more vocal. We just think that maybe women are more vocal because they are the more abused, the more reported population. But I think women are more understanding of this trauma. They advocate working again, coming out of trauma. They advocate therapy much more than men do. And this could be because of the socio-cultural factors in our society.
The reason why this topic has always interested me, when I was living in a metropolitan city, there was a case where a group of women raped a man and he subsequently died because of the trauma. As life unfolded, there were survivors that I do encounter, depressed, very ashamed.
Yes.
And therefore, this is the right time to speak about this. And the fact that you agreed to do this session is so amazing. Like we discussed.
Thank you. Yeah, and so the thing is that we are not just talking about male abuse from a sexual abuse point of view.
Correct.
I think male abuse is way more common, which is emotional abuse.
Yes.
And in fact, there was a study which was done by Safe Family Foundation, and it was found that 51% male, that 1 in 2 males report some kind of abuse. It could be sexual, emotional, financial, but there is some kind of abuse. And I think what men more relate to is the abuse which is transgenerational, which lives in families, from a father or from a grandfather, from a male relative, which is very, very common. In fact, even in my patients who come to me being sexually abused by a male cousin or a male relative, or maybe the house help who comes or who's staying with you in the house, more common than we understand, acknowledge, or speak about. Transgenerational trauma, abuse within the family dynamic is way more common than people acknowledge.
And yet we don't have enough studies to show the concrete statistics.
Absolutely, because female abuse is much more spoken about, acknowledged. Male abuse is hardly acknowledged, even in research and academic circles, right? Even our legal systems, social systems, where are the laws to protect men? And even if somebody reports, the social structure, the peer group, the relatives would make so much fun about the male because it directly is associated with what is called as mardangi, the male, the alpha male image that men have to live up to, right? So any kind of abuse that a male takes is associated with absence of this mardangi, which comes to being a male in the first place. Like you are not male enough, and hence you are being abused. It is not attributed to the abuser, but it is attributed to the victim by saying that, hey, you are not male enough. How could you undergo that abuse? And hence, because of that shame, because of that social sanctity, the social image that they have to live up to, they have to follow certain kind of family or traditional pattern, I should say, that they have to just live up to, that they are not even able to talk about it with their male peers. I think at least a female would, because there is so much awareness, or at least a female, though even women go through a lot of shame and guilt to report these cases, but they are more likely to report it compared to me. Isn't that interesting that though we think that men are more empowered, but when it comes to male abuse, they are actually less empowered than a woman to report it. And even if it is reported, there are women who threaten the males. It could be a spouse and the women, or it could be a boss in an office that a woman is exploiting. There are cases where the women threaten that if you report the abuse, I would make it a case of sexual assault against me. And the men also know that if a woman reports sexual assault, the law would favor the woman compared to the men, right? So all these factors go to men not reporting, not seeking help, not even seeking pure help when they are being abused.
That's heartbreaking. The entire concept of them being a man and the concept of their manhood being called into question is what makes them more vulnerable.
Yes.
Dr. Meghna,
I think the vulnerability lies in the whole concept of manhood itself.
Exactly. And that's the irony of the situation, isn't it?
Yes.
May I ask you, what are the typical signs or symptoms that a man might be experiencing abuse? And when I say abuse, as you mentioned, it's not just rape or sexual abuse, but abuse of all kinds.
The symptoms of to any kind of symptoms of complex PTSD that I keep on talking about, the relational abuse, trauma which follows, especially the relational abuse that I'm talking about. The single event abuse are usually called as PTSD, and the relational abuse which happens over a prolonged period of time and is recurrent is called as complex PTSD. And the symptoms are usually, they would respond to it with a lot of shock, disbelief, guilt, shame, over a period of time, depression, anxiety. And the characteristic is emotional flashbacks, where you keep on reliving not just the event, but the emotion that went with the event. So symptoms in men would be very similar to symptoms in women who have faced trauma. And trauma, like I keep on saying, can be of two types. A single event, like you mentioned, the rape case, the gang rape of a man. So that is a single event, and that would be PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder kind of symptom. Trauma can, the kind I mentioned, which is transgenerational, which lives in families, which is recurrent over a prolonged period of time, that would be complex PTSD. The symptoms are pretty much similar. Usually in the short term, men react to the abuse with disbelief, with shock, with guilt and shame. I just spoke about the guilt and shame of reporting or even processing the abuse. Over a prolonged period of time, it turns into anxiety, depression, the complex PTSD symptoms, emotional flashback, where you keep on reliving the emotion, the confusion, the sadness, the agitation, the anger that went with the trauma. Even if everything is fine in your current life, even if you have a great family now, maybe you are married, you have kids, you keep on going back to that anger, to that anxiety, to that fear again and again, not knowing why. So a lot of people say that they don't know why, but they keep on having these anxiety panic attacks. They keep on having these emotional meltdowns. They don't know why they end up crying. Some people say that they watch a movie and then it becomes too much. They can't even finish the movie, right? They become either so disturbed or so. These are things that keep on confusing them over a period of time, and they keep on reliving the emotional flashbacks, embodying those emotions over a period of time. If they are not resolved, it can lead to a lot of startles. You start mistrusting the world around you, and the mistrust continues for a very, very long time. Your entire worldview changes. So the hypervigilance, the emotional flashbacks, the anxiety, the depression, the mistrust, these keep on having a very long-term impact on the survivors.
Right. Before we approach coping strategies, I want to bring up a few things. Specifically for male sexual abuse, rape, or harassment. One, when it comes to male abuse, for women, it's typically a man abusing the woman. So for a man getting abused, who is the perpetrator mostly? Second, we all know that there are multiple reports of women who put fake rape cases against men. Also, what are the types of abuse that a man can go through?
Different kinds of abuse. It could be like the sexual abuse that we were talking about. It could be more common is emotional abuse, where, for example, I have this couple that I'm seeing, and the woman, both of them are professionals working for big companies, and the woman constantly keeps on telling him about how he is a failure, how he is not able to, how he is not good enough a man, how he is not able to really perform in bed. So a lot of times I have seen, and in fact that leads to a lot of cases of anxiety in men, where they start again, because somehow these things are directly related to manhood.
Yes.
It starts to shake their entire identity. So when, like, even success or failure in the professional world, for men it is way more serious. Matlab, if a man is not earning, the society kind of does not really forgive them, right? And when a woman keeps on rubbing it in, that you're not able to perform in your job, that you're not good enough, that you're not able to provide for us, or you're not able to perform in bed, you cannot really satisfy me. So these are not really physical abuse, right? But these are emotional abuses which can really take a toll on a man. And it becomes, like I said, for the man to even report it or to work on it also becomes very difficult, because they have nowhere else to talk about it. Whom will they talk to? They can't talk to their friends about it. They can't really kind of say that to anybody, that my wife is doing this to me, because the other male friends or relatives or family, the men's parents, nobody would want to hear it, and nobody would have the courage to even talk about it. So I think for men especially, I feel that taking the medical route, going to professionals who are trained in it to provide help could be the first step, at least where they can check their. So we have also spoken about narcissistic abuse, right?
Yes.
Again, typically we somehow tend to think of narcissists as men, somehow the popular image. Yes, there are women narcissists, and they can distort the reality for the man, where he starts to feel that this is me, and their entire self-esteem, confidence, their identity gets shaken. And I think the first step could be to just break the silence and seek therapy, where they can actually have a reality check and say, hey, is it because I am the problem, or is it the abuse that's the problem?
Yes.
I think that would be a good step, given the socio-cultural environment that most men, especially in patriarchal societies like India, the first step could be that men could seek medical help. They could visit a therapist or a urologist or any kind of medical help. That could be the first gateway to talking about their problems.
Yes. Men getting rape cases filed against them for fake reason is pretty well known. Now,
yes,
that must be tremendously, it must be a tremendous setback for them. That's also an abuse.
Absolutely. It is also an abuse. I long back, maybe 3-4 years back, I had read about an employee from a really big company who had committed suicide because he was fighting this fake rape case, and nobody took him seriously. I mean, the office, his own family, and ultimately the only way he thought would prove his innocence was that letter that he wrote before committing suicide. Men undergo a lot of torture, emotional trauma, when these fake cases get filed against them. I again know of a fake case which got filed against something who is a close friend and relative. In fact, they had to go into hiding. Not just him, his sisters and his family, his parents. So it affects not just the man, it affects the entire family around that.
Yes. And when we look at the scene behind these cases, these fake allegations, it's usually educated women who manipulate the system.
Absolutely. Power-hungry women, again, narcissism, something we have spoken about.
Now, the third point, for a female victim, when she is abused or raped, typically it is the man who is the perpetrator. For a male victim, what is the statistics like? Is it only the women who do it, or is it men and men also?
No. It's, in fact, I mean, I'm not really aware of the statistics, but just because based on my experience, I've seen it is men to men is also very common. Like I said, transgenerational, like in my previous podcast also, I had mentioned again and again that rape is less about the sexual urges. It's more about power, control and power dynamics, which is about, okay, I have to violate something which is so integral and important to you that after that violation, you will be subjugated forever, kind of thing, right? So the same power dynamics, the same violation works for men also, and a lot of times it could be a male relative. It could be a male or it could be a spouse, a female spouse. Ultimately, it does boil down to the power dynamic, where it is about let me violate you in ways that will destroy you.
I will break you. Right.
That will break.
Yes. For all forms of trauma and abuse, what are some go-to coping strategies that men can adopt in their life should they be a victim?
So again, if coping strategies can be unhealthy or healthy, right? And for men to adopt the unhealthy coping strategies is way more easier because it is just more accessible and socially acceptable to take to alcohol and vent out their pain as a alcoholic, crying, shouting, babbling on the streets is way easier. It is socially acceptable also.
That's
right? Okay, he's just drinking himself to death, taking drugs. All these unhealthy coping mechanisms, alcoholism, prostitution, these things become way more common in men. That is how they try to deal with their trauma. Also, anger. Anger, I feel, is the most common, unacknowledged way of how men deal with their trauma, their abuse. It could be emotional abuse at the hand of their parents or something like that. Typically, you will see then they turn into the version of themselves that they would have otherwise hated. Like I said, because they keep on reliving the emotional flashbacks, the anger, the anxiety, it keeps on revisiting them. Some of them develop certain kind of personalities, like avoidant personality, all because of the trauma, the abuse that they have undergone, and they have turned to certain unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with the trauma. Some of them, which is a very interesting response, is bond response. A lot of men finally figure out that the best way to survive, to feel safe, is to please their aggressor. You can't fight it, just keep on pleasing them, give in to them, which again keeps on maintaining their trauma.
I see a lot of abused husbands trying to please their wives.
Yeah.
And these unhealthy coping mechanisms are because of repressed emotions, and men fail to talk about them very often.
Yes, they fail to talk about it, but they continue to live it.
In contrast to unhealthy coping mechanisms, what would be some healthy coping mechanisms?
The healthy coping mechanism would be, first of all, accepting that this is there in your life. Men find it very difficult to accept also because they have to live up to a certain image. For men to to even break that image, to be vulnerable, I think that would be the first step towards healing. To accept, to process the trauma, and to know that even a man can be vulnerable. All this image about boys don't cry. I had seen this ad campaign around boys don't cry. It was showing exactly that. Boys, you grow up a child saying boys don't cry, and when the trauma happens, you keep on telling yourself boys don't cry. You keep on repressing the trauma, but it will come out as probably violence in your own family, and that is how abuse keeps on going on from generation to generation also, right? Because we have never really processed it, never really accepted it, never really worked upon it, never really cried about it, never really grieved the trauma that the childhood or the precious things that you lost in your life because of the trauma, because of the abuse, right? So I think a good way, again, the first step can be to accept that maybe things were not really perfect for the perfect, and you need not be the perfect man that society upholds, that your family is so proud about and who can be talked about. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be human. It's okay to say maybe something's wrong. It's okay to say that maybe I am carrying on the imprints of those wrong things and now passing it on to my current family, current friends, current relationship, and seek help. Go and seek help from a professional therapist. There are trauma-informed therapists, and start working on that. Socially acceptable coping mechanisms which men can look forward, if they are not open to the idea of therapy or going for professional help, could be at least to have a good social life. Because again, trauma makes it very difficult. Trauma makes you isolated. You don't feel like going out, talking to people, being there. Somehow you keep on, even in groups, you keep on reliving your trauma. The sadness just does not leave you, right? And somehow take that step to go out, to be with friends. Music can be a great healer too. Sports can be a great healer too. Martial arts. I think you suggested martial arts once. So these are great. These are healthy channels where you can take out your anger, take out your energy, and it is kind of leading to some kind of self-development as well. These could be the socially acceptable and yet healthy coping mechanisms that men can look forward
One thing for everyone to keep in mind is when we are talking recovery and coping strategies, it's not like Bimar Rogya, you take a shot of medicine and you're fine as an AA for emotional abuse or for trauma of this kind.
So it's not a linear curve. People think that, okay, I have taken 2 therapy sessions, now I am on the way up. It's not like that. It's a jagged curve. It's like suddenly there might be a dip and then, but what therapy really helps you do is the coping strategies help you, the turnaround time is way quicker.
Yes. When you go to therapy, it's more often that you will feel an immediate dip in your emotions because you're reliving the trauma. But over time, it'll pick up.
So the other thing is the recent advances in trauma therapy is that we really do not put the person again to relive the trauma till they're really ready for it. In fact, we keep on telling them this is something which is called as cue-centered therapy, where we help you recognize the cues that you are reliving the trauma, which could be certain kind of body sensations, which could be that you're getting angry too quickly. And these are certain kind of cues that you start to recognize that this is how my trauma is, this is how PTSD really looks in my emotions, in my thoughts, in my behaviors. This is how PTSD looks. And this is at this point, whenever I start to recognize that this is how I'm starting to behave, then I start to put in the coping strategies in place so that I don't have to go through that entire episode and get centered very quickly. This is how I now look upon it, as trauma basically keeps you away from the center like a pendulum, and with therapy the arc of the pendulum becomes lesser and the time you get back to the center becomes quicker. And we kind of invite you in therapy to relive the trauma only when the coping mechanisms are in place, so that you know that once you have started recognizing the cues, you have practiced your coping mechanisms enough, then you are more prepared to deal with the trauma, to relive the trauma again.
These are some great insights. I mean, I'm only imagining the millions of people who do not have access to specialists such as yourself, and they're just banging their head against a wall and trying to live from one day to the other. Dr. Meghna.
Also, trauma leads you to keep on ruminating on the event again and again, right? And it is not such a great thing. Yes, brain is trying to find a solution and some kind of acceptance of it is required. But ruminating on the trauma again and again and going back to it again and again, it kind of, beyond a point, it does deepen the injury as well.
It doesn't serve any purpose.
Yes, it doesn't set you free. Yes. It just keeps on handling you more and more.
Exactly. Dr. Meghna, what are some ways that society can address this issue on male abuse?
I think the first thing I feel in any kind of abuse, even narcissistic abuse, something we have spoken about, is creating awareness, letting a lot of people know, giving them those safe spaces where they can talk about it, know more about it. So creating those safe spaces as society, as individuals, is something we can all do. But at a society level, I think it has to do with the legal system. I feel the true empowerment comes through the legal system. When people are aware, they should have avenues to call up and say, hey, this has been happening to me, and how can the society, how can the law help me? And for that, I think some changes have to happen at the legal level itself.
Absolutely. As a society, we have to try and create a safe space for all abuse survivors to talk about their experience and be able to live without judgment or fear of judgment.
Absolutely. By safe space, I think the first feature of safe space is non-judgmentality. Imagine if there was no judgment on men, on their manhood, and the whole verdict which is passed that the abuse has happened to you because you're not man enough. If that was not there, a lot more men would be speaking about it. A lot more men would be helping other men get out of that.
That's such a circle.
Non-judgmentality would help. And I think that we can do at each of our level, right? When we hear of these cases, if we can keep away from judgment, away from labeling people, I think we have done our bit.
So true. Healing comes from non-judgmental listening ear. Thank you, Dr. Meghna, for shedding light on the topic of male abuse and offering such insightful solutions. This has been, I think, a learning conversation and an eye-opening conversation, not just for me, but for all our audience.
Thank you, Jamie, for having me here to talk about this very important, yet I feel the most unacknowledged topic, the elephant in the room topic. And it was your initiative. And thanks for doing your bit to spread awareness about it. Thank you so much.
I'm humbled. For our viewers, we will be putting some references for further reading if you are interested in the description.